Welcome to the show. We have a great show today. It's going to be a lot of fun. Once again, we're continuing with the kind of October theme of just creating some off-the-wall, maybe less practical, but more fun kind of fantasy weapons and stuff like that. So in my last video, I made a sort of World War I trench club style weapon, but I kind of updated it for the apocalypse. That one had interchangeable spikes, so you could have shorter or longer just by screwing them in. So this will be continuing sort of with that theme of versatility, interchangeability, but taking it in a different direction. So this is a rake I found at Walmart for about $7. I don't know what the deal is, but if you go and try to find like a replacement handle for a tool or even like a hardwood dowel, you almost always spend more money than you do just buying a cheap tool that already has a hardwood handle. So I went that route with this. I could have used a couple of older rakes and things we had around the property, but we're actually still using those. And I figured for $7, I might as well just grab a cheap one. So the first thing to do is to remove the head of the rake because I don't need that part, I just need the handle. And this was actually a little bit more challenging than I expected. I thought I would just kind of pinch this together and pull it out, but as you can see, I had to wail on it a little bit with the hammer, and I don't know, it was in there a little bit better than I expected. I think part of that might be that there's sort of a collar, that metal collar on the end there that was really holding things together and not really allowing much flex in the wood. With that done, I noticed that the handle was split out here toward the end. But that's actually okay because I'm going to be removing that tapered portion anyway. To make this project work, I will be embedding a threaded insert that's about 1/2 inch wide. So I really need as much wood material around that as possible. And obviously I can't have any cracks or anything like that in the wood. So after cutting the end off, I spent a little time working to get a hole drilled that was the proper diameter for this threaded insert. This was a little bit tricky because, as I understand it, there are two different kinds of threaded inserts. One is designed for hardwood, and the other is designed for regular construction use, like pine or whatever. And I think I got the wrong one. I had the one with the larger, kind of more aggressive threads, and I don't think that works real well with the hardwood. So there were a couple of errors that if I did this project over again, I would do those things differently. I'd get the proper insert for this. Because as it stands, I had to go a little bit wider than I wanted to when I was pre-drilling the hole for the insert. And that meant that the lockup between the threads on the outside of the insert and the wood was maybe not quite as strong of a lockup as it would be with one that was designed for hardwood. But after a little trial and error, I managed to get this threaded in there. And actually a little portion at the top broke off, but it was only maybe 1/4 inch of the threads, probably even a little less than that, 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch. So not enough to really get concerned about. Now, if I had this to do over, I probably would put some epoxy in there as I was threading this insert into the wood. I don't know how much strength it would really add overall, and this thing is never coming apart. You'll see in a minute why. But I think it would have given me a little bit more confidence that that insert wasn't going to work its way loose or wobble a little back and forth over time in use. But for a little fun project like this, something that I'm probably not ever going to have to go up against zombies with, this will do just fine. So next I went back to the collar. At first when I bought the rake, I thought it was a plastic thing and I wasn't really planning to use it. But I discovered as I was pulling it off of there that it is metal. I think it's actually steel. So I put that back on over the end of the handle and pounded it down, and you can see I trimmed it off. But I left a little bit there so that I could kind of peen that over and have a nice little sort of collar at the top. You know, with a good strong hardwood, that might not be absolutely necessary, but it definitely gives an added measure of confidence. And as you'll see in a few minutes here, it is really important to have a lot of strength right out at the end of this handle. Now, the way this weapon is designed, you can take pretty much anything with a 3/8 inch threaded shaft and install it at the end. And I was imagining a whole bunch of different weapons that you could make this way. But for today's project, I'm just doing the spear and the flail. Now for the spearhead, some of you may remember this one from another project I did. While I was making that spear from a cheap survival knife, I got a little bit of a crack in the spear shaft, and so I decided that at some point I would replace that. And this seemed like the perfect project to do it. Now I think the logic of this is pretty straightforward. I had a nice long 3/8 bolt, cut the end off of it, and joined it to the spear. But I will point out, I, of course, use the welder because I have one, and it seemed like an easy way to do it. But if you don't have a welder, there are other ways to do this, and I even thought about drilling holes and fastening it either with, running nails through and then painting them over, or even small bolts. And if you got creative, there would really be a lot of different ways you could do this without a welder. But if you really want a solid and secure lockup, it's really nice if you have a welder. And you can use that to really solidly join the two pieces of metal. Now, as I've mentioned previously, I am not an expert welder. I'm not a trained welder. I just tinker with it and do hobby type of stuff. So don't necessarily look at my welding beads or my welding job and think that that represents any kind of standard for welding. This is pretty much garbage, but it's garbage that should have good penetration and should do a very good job of joining these two pieces of steel. And I can always come in and clean it up with the grinder later. You may have heard the old saying, if you have to use a grinder to clean up your welds, you're a grinder, not a welder. So if that's true, I guess I'm a grinder. Now, I felt it was important, even though I probably won't be using this spear for any kind of actual combat or anything, I still felt like it was important to be sure that it was tough enough to handle the shock of being, thrown into a piece of wood or something like that. So I came in with the torch and gave it a really, really good tempering. You can kind of tell by the oxidation colors on there how hot it's getting. I'm sure I had this thing well above 500 degrees, which would be, normally that would be really high for like a knife, but something like a spear point, which is going to probably take some tremendous shocks. It's more important that this spear be tough and able to take that kind of abuse than that it hold a really good edge. So with the spear point done, it's time to assemble the flail. And for this part of the weapon, I am going to offer a shout out to ZNA Productions. He's a really, really talented kid that does a lot of different work on this sort of edge of fantasy and reality. If you haven't ever checked out his channel, definitely go and do that. He did a flail project about a week ago, and when I saw that, that was a part of the inspiration for this. Now, my flail is done a little bit different than his, but it's kind of along the same lines. I'm using a chain, and I'm using connecting links to hook that up to this big, meaty metal hook, which I felt had kind of the right combination of good weight and a real menacing appearance. Although, in truth, most of the damage it would do would obviously come from the weight. It's still kind of nice to have a hook shape for that intimidation factor. Although now that I think of it, I'm not sure if zombies respond all that well to intimidation. In any case, it should be effective. So with all these parts assembled, I thought about this a little bit, whether I wanted to leave it with this real rustic, grungy, urban look. I kind of like that bare metal with a little bit of patina on it. But this also seemed like the perfect project to try out something I've been thinking about for a while, which is using a metallic spray paint to give a more interesting finish to a project like this. So I went to the store and picked up a can of kind of expensive specialized spray paint. When it dries, it's supposed to have a look like hammered metal. I gotta be honest, I had my doubts about this, but when I was standing there in the aisle looking at the paint, one of the employees came up to me and she was really enthusiastic about this stuff. She was like, you need to try it. If you haven't used it before, it's awesome. So I took her word for it, and let me tell you, I'm glad I did, because at the end, this thing turned out really awesome. Of course, the old Rake handle had some of that cheap lacquer stuff on it that every manufacturer seems obligated to put on their beautiful hardwood. So I sanded most of that off and made sure to rough it up really good to give the best possible base for the spray paint. That paint takes about 24 hours to cure, so I hung that stuff up overnight. And in the morning when everything was dry, it was time to test it out on some pumpkins. So I guess the flail works pretty well. I guess it's time to test out the spear. Now, for anybody who thinks that I'm wasting food, let me show you something. You need to understand nothing goes to waste on our property. That's about all I have time for today. I do want to mention one other thing real quickly. If you decide to do a project like this, make sure to look into all of the applicable laws. I live in the United States. I live in a state that's real relaxed about people experimenting in their shop and doing this kind of thing. But this could easily be mistaken for an actual weapon. And if you're out driving around somewhere and you have this thing sitting in your back seat, you get pulled over or something, you can see the problem there. So just, look into whatever laws might apply to a project like this in your area before you attempt anything like this. Well, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you watching the video. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. And until next time, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the next video.